Well, now let's kick off this next session with United Sorghum Checkoff's Director of Agronomy, Brent Bean. Brent has spent more than 3 decades helping sorghum farmers in the High Plains, first in extension and then in the private sector, and now at the Sorghum Checkoff. And appears regularly in the pages of High Plains Journal with a column on sorghum production. Brent, thanks for joining us, and I'll let you take the screen away.
Good morning. Hope everyone can see me okay today, and we will try to get started if I can figure everything out here. Okay. Yeah, good to be here today and a good chance to talk to you about new technologies for sorghum. Primarily what we'll be talking about today is actually weed control technology. And this is something that's certainly been important for the checkoff for a number of years. We've put significant dollars into looking at research to develop these new technologies, and been working very closely with the seed and crop protection companies to make this happen. So we're certainly on the verge finally of seeing these technologies make it to the field. And I know there's been a lot of questions about this technology, so I'm going to try to hit some high points on these technologies and maybe clear up a few things. But we'll go ahead and get into this presentation and go from there. Certainly grass competition is a major problem in sorghum. And it's one of the reasons that we don't have maybe as many acres of sorghum as we'd like to have, because we just know we can't control grass. That's been a big issue. Certainly broadleaf weeds are also a big issue in sorghum as well as other crops, but at least in the other crops, for the most part, they've had options that they could use for grass control. We just haven't had that in sorghum, particularly from a post-emergent standpoint. The slide is showing some yield reductions based on different grass species. You can see where Johnson grass, shattercane, Texas panicum, or sometimes called brown panicum, very high yield reduction when you have those particular grasses in a field and if populations are bad enough. You look at some of the other annual grasses, barnyard grass, yellow foxtail, sandbur, prairie cup grass, maybe not as high, showing about a 40 to 50% reduction in yield, but these are documented cases here, and I'm sure if you've got a serious barnyard problem, your yield reduction is going to be worse than that. So grass has just been a big issue, and sorghum growers have rated that as being a major problem, and something that's very much needed is a way to control these grasses, particularly post-emergence. So fortunately, finally, we have some new technologies that soon will be commercially available. And there's 3 companies, or really there's essentially 5 companies that are making this happen with these different technologies. I do want to point out that all 3 of these technologies are non-GMO. And there's some confusion about that. Recently saw a tweet where someone said, well, these technologies are similar to Roundup Ready. No, nothing like Roundup Ready. They're not, they're non-GMO. These are also selective herbicides, where Roundup is non-selective, meaning it basically controls everything. These technologies, the particular herbicide that you use will determine what they're going to control. They're certainly not non-selective, but they are non-GMO, and I wanted to point that out at the very beginning here. Again, the 3 companies that are bringing this technology to forbearance. Corteva, or Pioneer, they have an ALS tolerant sorghum. It's actually a sulfonylurea tolerant sorghum. The trait name is Enzyme for that, and they'll be selling a herbicide called Zest, or nickel sulfuron. Advanta is working on technology that has imidazoline tolerance, and that is also an ALS, but they work a little bit different. Their technology is called iGrowth. UPL is their chemical protection, crop protection company that they're working with. UPL actually owns Advanta, but the product that they're looking at is Amazamox, or EmmaFlex will be the trade name. And then third is S&W. They'll be selling ACCS tolerant sorghum under the Sorghum Partner brand name, and their crop protection company they are working with is Adama, and QuasiPop is the active ingredient or the herbicide that'll be used there. So what I want to do now is just go through some slides talking about each of these technologies in a little bit more detail. We'll point out in this part of the presentation, I actually received slides from the different seed companies. Wanted to make sure that I got everything right, because there are some things that are somewhat confusing about some of these technologies. I didn't want to get out in front of the companies, or for that matter, behind them. So I'm actually using some of their slides that I'll talk from here today, at least at the beginning. As mentioned earlier, if we look at Corteva, the trait, what they're calling their sorghum that has the ALS tolerance is Enzen. So that's the trait name. I think we're familiar with using trait names in other crops. When sorghum, it's Enzen for Corteva. That will mean it is tolerant to the SU class of herbicides. More specifically, nickel sulfuron is the herbicide they're going to be using in that technology. The trade name of the nickel sulfuron is Zest. Okay, some people may be more familiar with that as accent Q that's used in corn, but in sorghum it will be called Zest. Also wanted to point out, this particular technology is fully labeled. They actually received the label in 2016 for Zest to be used in Enzen sorghum. So everything has been approved and it's basically ready to go. Corteva this year is doing a lot of testing of this technology. You can see from the map a lot of locations in and around Kansas where various trials are being done with Enzen sorghum. And they've actually been doing some of this work for a number of years. So a lot of testing being done with this product to make sure that it's going to be ready to go once they're ready to commercialize that. So when is it going to be commercialized? I think that's the question that everybody has. According to Corteva, it is soon. What does that mean? Well, not real sure what that means, but I do think it is soon, and very likely could be in 2021. They'll be making those decisions this fall. Right now, the sorghum hybrids that they're developing are in the final stage of their pre-production or pre-commercial validation program. And so depending on how that looks, as they evaluate this fall, they'll make the decision if they're going to commercialize that in 2021. If they don't, then I'm sure there'll be at least a lot more demonstrations being done with this particular technology. The way I see this technology, one, this technology has been fully approved by the EPA, so it's ready to go. All we're doing really is waiting on the hybrids to be approved by Pioneer and Corteva. Once that happens, the Zest label is there. We can use it. We have quite a bit of experience with Zest, or again, nickel sulfuron. And a lot of the growers are going to be familiar with that product as Accent Q in corn. Used to be used quite a bit prior to the Roundup Ready corn coming on the market. And we know it's effective. It is effective on a number of grass species, but it does have limited broadleaf activity. We'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later. One concern that I have is sulfonylurea grass tolerance or resistance. We do know that we have a lot of broadleaf weeds that have become resistant to sulfonylureas. Well, the same can be true for some of our grasses. Actually, the sorghum checkoff is going to be working with Dr. Kumar there at Kansas State to do some work as far as sampling a lot of fields around Kansas and even into Texas and Oklahoma, and then screening those for SU tolerance. So we hope to report on those results here in a few months. Do want to point out that Johnson grass and shattercane are not on that Zest label, okay? And the reason for that is for stewardship reasons. In other words, there was some concern, well, we might have some resistance developing in the Johnson grass and shattercane if we're spraying those particular grasses with this material. This, again, the Zest label was actually approved in 2016. And as part of that labeling, Corteva at the time did decide not to put the Johnson grass and shattercane on the label. And finally, I think we know that Pioneer does a really good job of vigorously screening their hybrids. And so I think once they do bring those hybrids to the market, we can have a lot of confidence they're going to have, one, very good tolerance to the herbicide, and then also be very competitive hybrids. Okay, changing gears and talking about the iGrowth weed control program. iGrowth will be brought to us through Advanta. Will be sold under the Alta brand. Again, this is an imidazolone tolerant sorghum, imidazolone tolerant sorghum. That is an ALS, but it's different. It's different from what you're going to get with an SU. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. One good thing about this technology, it is already being sold in Australia and Argentina and a couple other countries. I actually had the opportunity to see this technology last year in Australia in a commercial field. The herbicide, again, that's going to be labeled as a Mazamox. Growers may be more familiar with that as Raptor, that's been used in soybeans, or Beyond, that's been used in wheat. So we do have some experience with this particular herbicide, just not in sorghum. That is something we're working to gain, obviously, that experience in sorghum, but we can learn a lot about this technology just by looking and seeing how well the Mazamox maybe worked in soybeans or in wheat. One thing about this particular technology, it is going to have some broadleaf activity and not just grass. So that makes it a little bit different from the others. This is a map showing where Advanta and UPL are doing some testing this year. So again, a lot of the area is primarily concentrated in that Kansas area, and a number of locations, probably well over 50 locations that they're looking at this at. They are several universities that have access to this technology, and they're looking at it in various weed control systems where they're mixing it with different products and so on. So again, the way I see it, where's the eye grow of EmmaFlex? Well, very important. I think it's already commercially available in other countries. So the companies are very much committed, I think, to bringing this to the U.S. They are working on a label, and they expect that label to be approved by the first of the year. No guarantees there, can't be certain of that, but the expectation right now is that technology will be approved by December of 2020. We know that Advanta is serious about this technology because they're already booking seed sales. Growers will have the opportunity to do that. If you call your dealer now, I'm sure you could potentially book some seed. The EmmaFlex, that particular herbicide, is going to have both pre and post activity, which makes it, again, somewhat different than the other two technologies. And that's going to be important. And it also has broadleaf activity, pretty good broadleaf activity. Does that mean you're going to be able to get by with just using this herbicide without anything else? No, I don't think so. You're still going to be have to put down a pre-emergence herbicide, and even post-emergence, I think, is going to be a good idea to add something to that. But that does make this technology a little bit different. As I mentioned earlier, EmmaFlex is an ALS herbicide, but it's in the imidazolone subclass. So again, that makes it a little bit different. Just because a weed or a grass is tolerant to maybe an ALS to your sulfonylurea herbicides, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be resistant to EmmaFlex. Now, it could be. There could be some cross resistance there, but it doesn't have to be. So it's going to be important that we screen and know which fields we can treat with either the EmmaFlex or, for that matter, the Zest that Quark Tablet will have. The third technology is going to be brought to us by S&W Seed. Scott talked about this a little bit in his presentation this morning. The trait will be called DoubleTeam. So DoubleTeam sorghum is the trait. QuasiPop is the herbicide that's going to be used. So what is QuasiPop? Well, most of us are familiar with that as Assure. Assure has been used for a long time in cotton and soybeans. Got a lot of experience with it. We know it's very effective on a lot of different grass species. Adama has not yet released the trade name for QuasiPop that they'll be selling that product under, but we can expect to see that soon. Again, Adama is the chemical partner that'll bring us the herbicide, and they're also expecting a label by December of 2020. So again, no guarantees there. We'll have to wait and see if that actually happens. Did want to point out that S&W is working to get this technology not only in their grain sorghum, but also in their silage and other forage sorghums. You can see the map of where some of the trials are located at this year. Not as many trials that we saw with the other two technologies, but I think probably sufficient to give us an idea of how this technology is going to work, particularly in that Kansas area. So there are trials going on. Again, you can see from the map where those locations are at in 2020. As far as launch time, wanted to talk about that just a little bit with this particular product. I do think it's a little bit further behind the other two technologies. Even if the herbicide gets labeled this year or by the end of the year, they're still working on getting the P&T approval in Canada. They expect that to happen maybe in late 2021. And so probably the earliest we would see this technology is going to be 2022, could be even a little bit later than that. So it is behind the other technologies, but it is coming on, and they're working on this very diligently. You can see the picture. This actually is the same field at Groover that Scott showed earlier. The picture that Scott showed was earlier in the season. This is a little bit later on, and you can see that the grain sorghum is very tolerant. And then you can also see the effectiveness on the Johnson grass in this particular field was exceptional. So how do I see it? QuasiPop is a proven over-the-top grass herbicide. We know it works. Another plus I think for this technology is the grass resistance to the ACCA class of herbicides is relatively low compared to the ALS herbicides. So that's certainly going to be a plus, we think. Maybe one of the drawbacks, very little soil activity, which I guess can be a good or bad thing, depending on how you want to look at that. But then it's going to have absolutely no broadleaf activity. But we've known that for a long time. That's the way this herbicide is strictly a grass herbicide. And again, the timeline for full launch is likely going to be behind these other two technologies. So what can we expect from a grass weed control standpoint with these technologies? Well, I think we can look at how these herbicides have performed in other systems. So we'll take the nicosulfuron or the zest product that Corteva will have. If we look at how Accent has performed, we can get an idea of what to expect on the grass control. And as this would be in corn. So the table here is just giving you the ratings of various state extension specialists and how they view this technology. So again, with the zest or really the nicosulfuron or Accent that's used in corn, you can see the ratings that they've different state universities have given different grass species on the control. Same thing with the EmmaFlex. We'll look at what how this product has worked in soybeans with Raptor. Again, you can see those ratings on your screen. And then finally, with the QuasiPop, we're looking at Assure, and these would be, I think, mostly in a soybean environment. And you can look at those ratings and how the different universities are rating the grass control of different species. Broadleaf weeds. Well, in general, we're thinking of these herbicides as being grass, but the exception to that really is the EmmaFlex. It is going to have reasonably good broadleaf activity, so that's going to be a plus, I think, for that particular technology. If you look at, say, pigweed control there, for instance, Kansas and Nebraska both give it excellent ratings. Tennessee, on the other hand, surprisingly, gave it a poor. So I'm not quite sure what the difference is there, but some differences of opinion on maybe how that's going to do. In my personal view, I think it's going to be decent on pigweed, but you're still going to have to add something to that to get satisfactory control. Nicosulfuron or zest actually does have some broadleaf activity. You can see the way the three states ranked or rated pigweed control. I'm sure in this particular case, they're considering that pigweed being very small. My experience is it's not going to do a good job on bigger pigweed. Just coming out of the ground, maybe so. But again, you can see how that stacks up. The QuasiPop going to have absolutely no broadleaf activity, but should be strong on the grass. Something the checkoff is doing, we're sponsoring some trials this year where we're comparing all three of these technologies for grass control. And the way these were set up, these are in fallow fields where they had grass. There's no sorghum in these fields. So this is kind of a worst case scenario, putting a lot of pressure on the herbicide to work. I'm going to show you a little bit of data. We've got several of these trials out this year. I'm going to show you a little bit of data from Kansas. This is green foxtail control. This is at Garden City. Dr. Randall Curry and Pat Gear are running this particular trial. This is looking at pre-application. Well, the only herbicide that's got the pre on its label will be the EmmaFlex, so that's what we're talking about here. So we've got an EmmaFlex, and then we're comparing that to the more conventional pre-emergence herbicides we would use for grass control, being Dual, Warrant, and Outlook. So we got EmmaFlex applied at 6 and 9 ounces. We're getting very close to 100% control even 58 days after treatment. So very good control of green foxtail from a pre-emergent standpoint. You can see how that compares to the Dual, Warrant, or Outlook. This is showing some plots there at Garden City. The untreated to the left, and then onto the right on the screen is 29 days after that 6-ounce application. Again, you can see it looks good, doing a nice job. Post-application. So now we're able to compare all three of these technologies. Again, this is a worst case scenario because we don't have a crop out there to compete. So this is putting, again, a lot of pressure on controlling the grass. Again, we have the EmmaFlex at 6 and 9 ounces, giving us, after 22 days, roughly 70% control. The QuasiPop, 6 and 10 ounces, roughly 75% control with the 6 ounce, but we had over 90% control, 10 ounce rate. The Zest, at that full rate of 1 ounce, was approaching about 80% control. Now, I would expect if we had sorghum growing in this field, these control levels would be higher with all three of these technologies because this is putting a lot of pressure on those herbicides to control the grass. Next year, we'll probably do that, try to compare all three technologies with sorghum and really take a good look at that. And I do want to point out, we'll be sharing a lot more information from different locations and different grass species on how these herbicides we're comparing this winter. Rotation restrictions is something that are always going to be on people's minds and should be. Really shouldn't be any problem with any of these technologies to rotate to just about anything you want to rotate to. The EmmaFlex has a little bit longer residual, but shouldn't be a problem. 8.5 months to corn, anytime to soybeans, wheat 3 months, cotton 9 months, and then sorghum 9 months. So it shouldn't be an issue. You will notice on the Zest, it says 18 months. So that is the current restriction to plant sorghum back following Zest application that was applied post-emergence. I also want to point out, for that matter, on the Zest label, the way it currently reads, you're not really allowed to plant sorghum the following year anyway, once Zest has been used. With the EmmaFlex and the QuasiPop, or the DoubleTeam sorghum, I believe on those labels. Now, we haven't seen the labels. Things could change, but more than likely, you will be able to plant sorghum after sorghum in those particular technologies as long as you follow certain stewardship guidelines. But again, don't want to get ahead of what the label is going to read, and because it could change. And so we'll see once those have been approved what we can actually do from that standpoint. But for the most part, we don't plant a lot of sorghum back to back anyway. That's the exception, certainly, rather than the rule. Stewardship guidelines, and I'm not going to spend really any time on this. We could spend 30 minutes on talking about stewardship guidelines associated with this particular technology. But all three of these technologies are going to want you to use a good pre-emergence herbicide. And really, I think all of them are going to want you to use a herbicide in that group 15 class. So use your Dual, your Warrant, your Outlook. That's going to greatly help the weed control as well as extend the longevity of this technology so that we avoid resistance. The second thing we want to be very careful and cognizant of is shatter cane and Johnson grass outcrossing. With research that's been done the last 4 or 5 years that Sorghum Checkoff is sponsored, we know the chances of gene flow to Johnson grass is really very, very low. It is a little bit higher in the shatter cane. But regardless, we want to do a good job of protecting this technology. So what that means is we need to control grass, particularly the shatter cane and Johnson grass, in our bar ditches around this technology, particularly at flowering time. When your sorghum is flowering, shedding pollen, gives the opportunity to possibly have some gene flow. We want to make sure there's no Johnson grass or shadow cane close by that's also flowering and can receive that pollen. So a couple of stewardship points that I did want to make in this particular presentation. In closing, expectations for 2021 really depends on what Quark Tablet decides to do with the NZ sorghum. We know it's in the very final stages of commercial development. They'll be making that decision here in the next probably 3 or 4 months on if this will actually be commercially available next year. If not, it will be very soon. And I'm sure at the minimum we'll have more demonstrations being done with that technology in 2021. The iGrow sorghum from Advanta, it's full speed ahead. Assuming they get the label approved by the end of 2020, they will be selling seed and it'll be commercially available in 2021. Certainly at the minimum, we're going to see more demonstrations, but if things go as planned, they'll have a label by the end of the year. The DoubleTeam sorghum, a little bit further behind. They're also actually hoping to get a label by the end of 2020, which would be nice because that'd make it easier to do some field demonstrations in 2021. So we'll keep our fingers crossed and hope that that happens. But in reality, we're probably looking at sometime between 2022 and 2024 where we really see a full launch of that particular technology. With that, I would be glad to answer any questions. You see my contact information there on the screen, but I'd be glad to talk to anybody anytime about this technology. I'm sure I didn't answer all the questions that are out there, but be glad to take those questions.
Hey, thanks, Brent. I always learn so much whenever you speak. I've used you as a resource for so many years, and I appreciate all your knowledge and experience. Remember, folks, if you've got questions, click on the chat button at the bottom of the screen, and when the box comes up, type your questions in there, and we'll ask them to Brent. While we're waiting on those, Brent, this may be a dumb question, but the first thing that comes to my mind as a reporter is, what happens if we use one of the chemistries on a different sorghum that it's matched to? So if we use the UPL chemistry on, say, the Corteva trait.
Right. Yeah. Good question, and it's important to keep up with that. Just like with other crops, if you've got Roundup Ready corn planted, you don't want to put Liberty on the top of it. So depending on the technology you're using, you've got to be sure you match that up with the right herbicide. Absolutely, or you will flat kill that sorghum. There'll be no question in your mind that you did the wrong thing.
Good to know. Good to know. We talk a lot about stewardship of traits and things. It's going to be very critical it sounds to me like it's going to be very critical for sorghum growers to really get into a mindset of stewarding these traits, these chemistries. You've been around enough that you understand farmers. What's your advice to them? Well,
I think farmers are somewhat used to stewardship guidelines around some other technology, but this is going to be a little different because of the close relatives of shadow cane and Johnson grass. We want to make sure that we do a good job on stewardship. Even outside of those two grasses, we don't want our green foxtail to become resistant. And so, the stewardship guidelines will stress using multiple mode of actions. We hear weed scientists talk about that all the time, but we want to be sure we do a good pre-emergence program. That's number one. And then even from post-emergence standpoint, when we can, use more than one active ingredient. And certainly the next year, when we go to another crop. So, for example, if I were using the DoubleTeam sorghum and I was using QuasiPop as my herbicide, and I'm planting soybeans the next year, be aware that you use QuasiPop and ACCAs and avoid using that technology in soybeans the next year. Use something different, and that'll make this technology last a long, long time. And that's what we all certainly want. We worked hard to get this technology to the market, and we don't want to lose it after just a few years.
Boy, I'm sure glad that you have learned how to pronounce QuasiPop. And I'm really hoping that they have a much more easier pronounceable name when it finally gets registration approval.
I do too.
We do have some questions from online. Josh Lofton, He says, Brent, sorry if I missed it. Have they decided on late application date or growth stage of these products? And he's also hoping that the label includes something about canola and winter broadleaves because we still have some of those in the region.
Yeah, I mean, I think as far as growth stages, I don't know for sure how the label will read on especially the Emmy or the ACCH technology yet. We'll have to wait and see how those labels read, particularly I think with the DoubleTeam sorghum. But I think for the most part, we're going to want to get these, regardless of what the label says to some extent, we want to get these herbicides on early. So it's going to be much easier with any of these technologies to control the grass when it's small. We actually saw that in the trial we were doing this year with the green foxtail. They're both at Hayes and at Garden City this year. We had two different application times. The control was much better when we applied those herbicides early versus late.
Okay. From Jordan Shear, do we have an approximate cost per acre for seed and herbicides for the Emmy technology?
Good question. And I have not seen a price on that yet. So be sure and ask about that. I can tell you, just to kind of follow up on the Emmy sorghum, they are going to be having a virtual field day. I believe it's October 15th. And so people can join in on that particular conference or virtual field day and learn more about this technology. And hopefully at that time, maybe answer that particular question, because I'm curious too on the price.
I'm glad you brought that up, Brent. Yes, Sorghum Frontiers, the second virtual Sorghum Frontiers, will be October 15th, and you can register for that online at hpj.com/Sorghum Frontiers. Brent, working with the checkoff as you do, and you are part of the team that helps the farmers steward their checkoff dollars and put forth towards research projects that have come up with the building blocks that allow companies like this to bring these to market. What are some other things in the pipeline that farmers are putting their checkoff dollars towards that may answer future questions? What's some exciting work that checkoff funded work that we want to brag on?
Yeah, well, we continue to look at the herbicide technologies. There's other herbicides out there that we certainly have an interest in, and so we'll continue to look at those opportunities to fund projects. Really, for the next year or two, we're going to be putting in significant dollars, just getting, working with these three technologies that are coming out and making sure we know how to best use those. For example, comparing the three technologies is going to be important, because if you have, say, giant foxtail, that one of these technologies may do a better job than the other in controlling that particular grass, or sandbur. And so we want to try to answer those questions in the near future. We're very interested right now, especially in quality traits. So protein is something that we're looking at and beginning to put money into. One of the speakers earlier today mentioned waxy sorghum. We're going to be running some trials on waxy sorghum. That's kind of a different subject altogether, but I'm sure in the future you'll be hearing us talking about waxy sorghum and some other things.
That was going to be my next question. We're working towards, it feels like we're segmenting out the different uses of sorghum, much like, we have different varieties of wheat that perform better in, Durham versus your hard red winters, right? It feels like we're really targeting the end users with some of these sorghums that are coming online. Are we going to see more of that? More market opportunities for growers if they choose this variety, they can go this stream?
I think we will. I think even the international market, the Chinese market, and others, we know they maybe prefer a certain kind of sorghum. So I think we'll see more of that. Domestically, the food market continues to grow. Sorghum is, again, non-GMO, non-gluten. Sorry, wheat, but non-gluten. That is something that a certain group of consumers want. And so we see that segment continuing to grow. Something we did this year for the first time, we did sponsor a couple of strictly, our straight food grade sorghum trials, field trials, to compare some of these food grade sorghums. So that is something else that's becoming important. But no, I think we will see in the future. We'll see more identity preserved, where certain varieties are going to a certain particular market.
Okay. Well, any final thoughts, Brent?
No, just to encourage anybody to get a hold of me if they have any questions on this technology. I know some of it can be confusing, but let us know. Also, you mentioned what research projects we're working on. Anybody has any ideas on research projects that they think the checkoff should be funding? Give us a call. Talk to your sorghum board representative, and they can get back to us. But we're always looking for good ideas.
Well, hey, thanks, Brent, as always, for coming on out and helping us tell the story of sorghum. It looks like Alan Alan, I'm not going to try to pronounce that last name, sir. Is there any work or research being done to reduce the itchiness of sorghum? The best thing about an arrowhead is not having to get out and work on Milo fingers or Old 50.
Well, it's a good question. Occasionally comes up. That is an irritant that we would love to get rid of, but we haven't figured out a way to do that yet. Basically, it has to do with the fineness of the dust that's coming off sorghum. And if you actually look at that dust, it's prickly compared to some of the others. So that's what's kind of causing some of that itchiness. Don't have a good solution for that, and unfortunately, I don't think we will anytime soon. But hopefully, people will be willing to plant sorghum, even though it may be a little itchy at harvest time.
Well, here's hoping that at some point in time, some very intrepid researcher down the road has that answer.